Hello, I want to invite you to yet another important discussion on research. One of the most important basic concepts that is widely used or applied in research is called a variable. And therefore today, our focus will be on variable with a special leaning towards the meaning, the types, and important traits of a variable, or rather a variable. It is an important debate or a discussion that I want all of you to pay attention to, since it forms the basis upon which research objectives, even research problems, research questions, and even hypotheses are based. Variables also guides in the literature review as well as in determining which kind of sampling methods as well as research instruments are relevant for that particular study. So it is an important area that I want you to focus and pay much attention on. Let us begin by having some introduction about this area. And I want to begin by observing that the main objective of any research, or the main goal of any research, is to describe and explain variance in the world. By variance, we simply mean the variation that occurs naturally in the world, or change that we create as a result of manipulation of certain issues. A variable is therefore the term that is assigned to the variation or change that we intend to explain or describe in research. In other words, at all times, researchers are interested in understanding how changes occur, what causes these changes, and how those changes are likely to occur in the future. These changes can at times be out of natural events like weather, or they can be out of human manipulations. For instance, a change in individuals' level of education, level of earnings, ranks at the workplace, among others. These are things that are done by human beings, and therefore they are as a result of manipulation. These changes are normally important in research, and the changes that occur in research, or the variations that we observe in research, are what generally are assigned to the term variable. What then is a variable? A variable is understood as a concept which takes on different qualitative values such as weight, height, income, and age. For instance, if we take income as an example of variable, we consider income as a variable because it can change, it can take different values for different people, for the same person, or at different time. For instance, two or more people may not earn the same income, and therefore the income can vary from one person to the other, either because of their level of education, work experience, or certain important qualities or skills that they hold. At the same time, this income may also change, a person's income may also change over time. For instance, when one is freshly employed after leaving college, the amount of income he earns at that job might not be the same that he may earn 10 or 20 years after initially being employed. Therefore, income might vary over the years. That's why we are saying that a variable is anything that changes. Even if we take weight as an example, sometimes over the years we don't have the same weight. At some point when we were young, our weight was lower, it increased, and sometimes we also reduced our weight intentionally through exercises if it is felt that certain weight might not be good for our health. Height also changes as well as the age. Therefore, a variable is considered anything that is quantitative in nature but changes over time, or it varies from one person to another, or from the same person it varies but across time and space. An important issue that we need to note about a variable is that a variable is normally assigned certain attributes. By attribute we mean characteristics or qualities that describe something. For instance, if we take level of education as a variable that we intend to study and study about, then level of education can be assigned attributes such as no formal education, primary education, secondary education, college education, and even university education. If we take a variable such as gender, it can also be assigned as male or female. If we pick a variable as, say, source of income, it can also be assigned different attributes. For instance, one person's source of income could be formal employment, another person could be casual employment, another one may derive his income from business, another one farming, and so on and so forth. And therefore, when we talk about variable, we simply mean something that whose value varies or changes, such as weight, height, income, and age. But we've also observed that a variable must be assigned certain attributes that we use to describe it. And of course, I've given the example of education and even income. Variables come in many forms. One of them is what we call continuous variable. I think this issue I also discussed it in the types of data, but now we want to look at it as a variable. A continuous variable is one that assumes the values that can be quantified up to decimal points. That is, from one whole number to an infinite number. For instance, age, income, weight, and height can be seen as examples of continuous variables. For that matter, therefore, a person can say that he or she is aged 40.5 or 40.5 years, or he or she weighs 92.78 kilograms, or earns an income of 10,000 and 3 shillings and 50 cents, among others. So, when we talk about continuous variable, we simply mean a variable that can be quantified into both whole number, fractions, or decimal points. I've given you the example of age, income, weight, height. Even distance, you can talk of 30.78 kilometers. Any variable, therefore, that we are possible to measure it up to fraction or decimal points, that variable qualifies as continuous. Another type of variable is called discrete variable. A discrete variable is one that has a finite number of variables between any 2 points. They simply refer to variable which can be presented in an integer form, such as the number of children. Therefore, any numerical variables which can be realistically counted, such as the number of children, number of pupils, number of coins, is called a discrete variable. Perhaps one of the most distinguishing features between discrete and continuous variable is that a discrete variable is expressed in a whole number. For example, the number of children, you will simply say 4 children. We don't have 4.5, 4.25, or 4.1 or 4.2 children. The number of pupils, the same. The number of trees, the same. The number of cows, the same. So any variable that we can express in a whole number without decimals or fractions, we call that type of variable discrete variable. One of the most common ways of categorizing variables has been independent and dependent variable. So I want us to understand what is meant by independent variable. An independent variable is one whose variation do not depend on another variable. That is, they're the one that makes other variables to occur or behave in a given way. They are considered as control inputs whose variation depends on the researcher or individual working with the variable. For example, if we wanted to look at the relationship between one's level of education and income, then the understanding here is that income is affected by one's level of education, or a person's level of education influences the amount of income he gets. In this case, therefore, it is the level of education that causes income to behave in a particular manner. That is, income can be more, income can be less, depending on one's level of education. In that case, therefore, the level of education is the independent variable because it causes income to occur. Another example might be, for instance, we want to look at the relationship between gender and programs of choice at the university. In this case, we are saying that the type of program a person chooses at the university depends on the gender of that person. Therefore, it is the individual's gender that causes the type of program an individual decides to pursue at the university. In that case, therefore, gender is the independent variable because it causes the type of program a person decides to pursue. Perhaps the last example might be, we want to look at, for instance, the influence of one's level of education on the type of career a person pursues. So in this case, the type of career you choose to pursue is determined by your level and type of education. Again here, education becomes the independent variable because it causes what kind of career you pursue. Overall, therefore, An independent variable is one that makes other variables to behave in a particular way. Independent variables are generally characterized by what we call attribute variables. An attribute variable is one which cannot be manipulated by the researcher during the study, such as age, gender, income, skin complexion, among others. In other words, it is the other variable whose behavior or status is caused by the independent variable that a researcher can manipulate. Independent variable, by its very nature, is independent of the researcher's manipulation. It remains the way it is in the study. Because if you change its status, then it is difficult to determine how exactly it causes other variables to occur. In that case, therefore, it remains and it stands what it is for you or for a researcher now to determine how that variable makes other variable to behave in a given way. Another important variable that is often used in research is dependent variable. Dependent variables are variables whose changes depend solely on the other variables, in this case, independent. Therefore, independent variables influence dependent variables, but dependent variables cannot influence independent variables. In other words, the status of dependent variable is determined by the independent variable. For example, the income is dependent variable, and one's level of education is independent variable. Our assumption here is that the kind of education you have influences or determines the type of income that you have. Therefore, your income depends on your level of education. The other issue that it is important to observe about dependent variable is that the dependent variable takes the form of an active variable. An active variable is one which can be modified according to the needs of the study. For example, we want to understand a person's level of education and a firm's or organizational performance. So we are saying that organizational performance depends on the level of education of its CEO. The level of education of CEO cannot be manipulated because it is an independent variable, and therefore it remains as it is. But firm performance or organizational performance, we can decide to manipulate it as a researcher. So that we might say that performance in an organization would mean one that has a stable working capital, one that is making profit, and one that has a good market share. In that case, therefore, profitability, adequacy of working capital, and market share are the ways through which we are measuring organizational performance. In that case, therefore, we are manipulating organizational performance to be understood and to fit into the needs of the study, which in our case would imply profitability, working capital, or what we call liquidity, as well as market share. So that is how we manipulate dependent variable, and that's why we call it an active variable. We manipulate it to suit a particular need of our studies. The last thing that I want us to look at under variable is what we call traits. Variables or good variables have two traits. One, exhaustiveness. When we are comprehending or operationalizing a particular variable, it is required of researchers to ensure that they include all possible answerable responses in any given variable. For instance, if our variable is level of education, and perhaps when we are collecting data, we have only offered two options to the respondents, that is primary education and secondary education. If you observe that, that list of options for the level of education excludes certain levels of education, such as people with no formal education, people with the college education, as well as university education. Therefore, when we are constructing our variables and we're now attempting to describe it by giving various options, we must ensure that we completely exhaust all the possible response options or response categories so that all respondents have rather are catered for in terms of the kind of responses they can give. If, for instance, we were asking respondents to state their level of education, and we only provide two options, primary education and secondary education, how about respondents who do not have formal education? How about those who have college education? How about those who have university education? It means we have not covered them. It means they are not catered for the study. However, we may exclude deliberately certain options if our study is focusing on, say, a given level of education. For instance, if our study is focusing on individuals with the primary and secondary level of education alone, then there is no harm if we exclude those who do not have formal education, those with college education, as well as those with university education. Otherwise, if our focus is on the level of education generally, then it is important that we include all the options that are available within the level of formal education as it is understood. However, sometimes the list of options may be too long, and therefore it becomes totally impractical to include all of them in the questionnaire. What then do we do? For instance, if we have an option, rather we have a variable that has as many as 20 options. Sometimes when we are constructing a questionnaire, it is not easy to provide a question with options that are as many as 20. In that case, what is expected of us to do is that we simply list the most common attributes, maybe 3 or 4 or 5. Then others, we use the word others. That is, so that if you are not among the 5 that were specifically, that have been specifically identified, and you fall in the option of, say, number 6 to 10 or number 6 to 20, depending on the number of options that are available in that area, then if you choose 6 because it is outside the 5 that have been categorically stated, then in that case you will fall under the category others. That is basically what we are required to do to circumvent a situation whereby the options that are available in any given variable are too many. Otherwise, we are required at all times to ensure that our options in any given variable are exhaustive. So, being exhaustive in the way we provide options is an important trait in any variable setting. The last issue that I want to look at in this presentation is mutual exclusivity as a trait or variable, or a variable trait. Mutual exclusivity basically implies that respondents should not be subjected to a situation in which the options in a variable that are provided to them, more than one option applies to them. We need to present variables or describe variable categories in such a way that only one option in any given variable is applicable to a given respondent. For instance, consider marital status as a possible study variable. We know that marital status can be categorized into single, married, divorced, and separated. It's upon the researcher to ensure that each of these options are clearly stated and explained to the respondent so that the respondent can make an informed choice. It should be clear that being single means that you have never been married before, or you are married and you lost your couple, your partner. If that's the case, then a person who had never been married before, or was married before, but his or her partner died, would know that in the context of this study, he is a single person by marital status. It should also be made clear to the respondent that being divorced means that due to certain problems that you encountered in marriage, you presented your disagreement in a court of law, and the court declared that marriage over. That's the meaning of divorce. It's also the duty of the researcher to explain to the respondent that being separated implies that there are certain issues in your marriage that cannot make it possible for you to continue staying together as husband and wife. And for that reason, you have decided to stay away from each other. As you give yourself time to think about the issue and decide whether to proceed with your marriage or have it terminated by a court of law. That is separation. However, a researcher should also make it clearly to the respondent that separation does not mean physical separation. That, say, due to work, the husband is working in Nairobi and the wife is working in Kisumu, and therefore they are physically in different places. That is not separation. All these things need to be put clearly to the respondents. One more important example might be that, say, of income, source of income. We may have a situation whereby a person has more than one source of income. This person is employed, he has a business that is running, he's also doing farming. He's getting income from these three sources. And therefore, if you give options without clear instructions, a respondent might find that being confusing because all the options apply to him. Because he has income from employment, he has income from farming, and he has income from business. How then do you ensure that you frame a question in such a way that it's applicable, only one is applicable to the respondent? You may frame it in this manner. State your main source of income. So the word here, main. And by main, you mean one that gives that person the greatest amount of income. So if the person feels that what he gets from formal employment is higher than what he gets from the other two sources of income, then he will pick formal employment as his main source of income. If he considers business, he will pick business as his main source of income. If he considers farming, then he will pick farming as his main source of income. That is the end of our discussion today. Thank you.